The prevalence of conflict in people's lives, I think it happens more often than people want to be honest about. I think conflict is a normal thing that we go through throughout the week or throughout our entire lives, whether it be at work, in our families, with our children, or with our partner in specific. I think because we're talking about relationship, when you're in relationship with another person, there can be differences of opinion that arise. So sometimes there is a lot of conflict that we have to learn how to resolve or work through in order for us to maintain healthy relationships. I think conflict is very debilitating for a lot of people. Some of us are not very good with conflict. Some of us don't like confrontation. And some of us are also not very good at sharing our feelings or our opinions about one specific thing in maybe the most effective way. And so when we're uncomfortable with those things, or we don't have the skills necessary to be able to have an open and honest conversation about what's going on, we tend to avoid the conflict. And that can lead to problems throughout the course of our lifetimes, whether it be at work, if you have a conflict with a coworker, or within your relationship. If we are not aware of how we feel about conflict, if we don't deal with it in the right way, then it can have lasting impacts in everything that we do. I think the most practical steps to take when we know that we're facing a conflict or a disagreement, the first being, number one, try to stay calm, as whatever that means to you. If that means kind of having a zen quiet moment where you're able to reflect on what you're feeling or what you're thinking in the moment, or having a seat, just so that you're able to collect your thoughts about what's actually going on. So staying calm in the moment when conflict arises is very important, because we also wouldn't want to make the situation worse than what it has to be, or have the idea of compromise take longer, because our goal should always be resolution as quick as possible so that we can continue developing that relationship. So that would be the number one thing that I would want people to know. When we identify conflict, remember to stay calm. The second thing would be identify what the problem actually is, whether it be within your relationship or at work. Identify what is actually causing the conflict, or what actually happened that is making you feel uncomfortable in that moment. And the very next thing that we should do after we identify what the problem actually was is identifying if it's a big conflict that's going to require a lot of attention and energy, or if it's a small conflict that can get resolved in a shorter amount of time. So those are the first three things that I think people should do when they see or they feel conflict is arising. I think part of this is a personal journey. I think I have to know myself well enough to know how I respond to conflict in order to understand what specific ways for me work to get through something. If that means first taking a 5-minute timeout so that I can take a breather and think about things before re-entering a difficult or more heated conversation, or if that means allowing myself to just verbally express everything that I'm feeling in one go around and feel like I'm being heard in that moment. So finding at least one or two ways for you that works, that helps you at least start the process of resolving the conflict, is very important. And then identifying if your resolution techniques are similar to that of the other person's, so that you guys can kind of work on where the starting point will be. So the most typical type of conflict, people associate that within intimate or partner relationships. And from my experience doing couples counseling or couples therapy over the years, I have found that if there is prolonged seasons where there is a lot of conflict, that in the long run can jeopardize or weaken the strength of your relationship long term, where people will feel the end result will have to be separation or divorce because the conflicts were never really appropriately managed at that time. So it is super important when we find a conflict, when we are confronted with something difficult for us, even though it's difficult or uncomfortable, that we do try and attempt to work through it. A pretty simple example of a type of conflict that can arise within relationships would be maybe the woman or the man or your partner, whoever that may be, feeling that they're not being supported. That could be emotionally or physically with things around the house. I think a lot of us know that to function in a home, there are lots of things that need to get done. And so if one person is feeling like they're carrying more weight than the other person, that can create a lot of of undue stress on that person. So one of the things that typically we would want to say is, you don't help me with anything. So we already have a conflict, but by saying you don't help me with anything, we're attacking the other person and making the conflict actually worse. So one of the most important things that we can do when we feel there's a conflict within ourselves or within our relationship is really expressing how we feel about the problem. These are techniques that we usually, they're effective communication techniques is what we call them. So the first one that I would recommend is using I statements, meaning I feel, or I think, or I believe, to be able to really get the person into partnership with you. Because if we're attacking, if the first words that come out of my mouth are you never do this, or you're always doing this, someone may get very, very defensive. And because of that defensiveness, we are no longer able to come into communication or connection with each other. So if we do feel something very strongly, even if we want to attack the other person, always remember that it's important that I want them on my side. I want them to understand what I'm feeling or what I'm thinking, so I need to start with how I feel or how I think about the situation. So an example could be, I feel like we need to talk about chores around the house, instead of you never threw out the garbage. So simple things like that can really help start a conversation in a healthier way so that it ends in a healthier way, versus starting a simple conversation in the wrong way and having it end way worse. Another effective communication technique that I often recommend to people is also active listening. Sometimes when we're talking to another person, we are thinking more about what we want to reply instead of what the person is actually saying. So when we practice active listening, it's me actively sitting here trying to understand 100% what the other person is trying to get across. And that's very important, because sometimes we do have different opinions. And in order for me to respect the other person's opinion, I do have to understand it. So I have to try to actively listen to their stance in order for me to understand where they're coming from. And then another really common one is validation. I think a lot of people will try to minimize another person's feelings because they think their feelings are more important or bigger. And that's okay that you feel that way, but it is also not okay to invalidate another person and their experience. So when we're having a conflict with somebody and they say, well, I feel like you're always doing this, you can say, thank you for being honest with me. I know that it's, I know that sometimes I could be this. That really allows us to take ownership of our responsibility within the conflict. And when someone sees that I'm able to be vulnerable and take responsibility, then they're willing to get into conversation with me. So really validating another person's feeling minimizes a lot of the he said, she said, or you said and I said, and the conflict that tends to arise. If you feel like the conflict is getting nowhere, and in fact it's getting worse and worse, and there's really nothing that you guys can come up with to really help the situation, I really recommend having a third party or a third person perspective. Sometimes having another person's perspective helping guide us through what our values are, what our standards are, and what we really want to get out of that relationship is really important. So if you need help from somebody, ask help. I wouldn't necessarily ask you to call someone in off the street or a friend. I would really want this person to be someone that you really truly trust. If that's a spiritual leader, if that's an elder in your family who you really respect and honor, or even a mental health professional, someone who's really able to guide you through that situation. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you feel like you identified with any of the things that we were talking about today, please give us a call. I'd love for you to schedule an appointment so we can sit and chat. Thank you.